Welcome. I'm Catherine Garcia. I'm the Director of State Operations and Infrastructure for New York State. And today I have the distinct privilege of introducing really two esteemed experts to talk about, not everyone's cup of tea, but cyber regulation and national security. It is really an absolute pleasure to be introducing the Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, Dr. Keren Yarhi-Milo, and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology, Ann Neuberger. Dean Yarhi-Milo is a world-renowned expert in international security and crisis decision-making, and also the youngest dean in SIPA's history. She joined the tenured faculty at Columbia in 2019 after a decade at Princeton. In 2023, she founded and launched the Institute of Global Politics, a world-class institute with a faculty advisory board chaired by former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, who will be talking with Governor Kathy Hochul later this morning. Ann is the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies in the White House. Previously, she served at the National Security Agency for over 10 years in a variety of senior intelligence and cybersecurity roles, including as Director of the National Security Agency's Cybersecurity Organization and Deputy Director of Intelligence Operations, where she led an organization of over 20,000 people globally. Please join me in welcoming them very warmly.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I think we missed the most important part about Ann's resume. She's a graduate of SIPA. A SIPA alumna, and we cannot be more proud. And
proud is part of my resume.
There you go. It's so wonderful to be with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know that you are very busy, a lot going on at the moment. And it's always great to have you. And today, especially when there's so much to talk about. Both in terms of where we are, thinking about cyber challenges, thinking about the incredible work that you have done from the administration, as part of the administration, and thinking ahead of what the challenges that we're going to be facing and the next administration will be facing. So a lot to talk about, so I'll start with the first question. This past year, the Biden administration, as you know, released the National Cybersecurity Strategy. And that strategy underscored the importance of strengthening public-private partnerships and developing a really resilient cyber workforce, building up defenses against state-sponsored cyber attacks. And we see this, from China, from Russia, Iran, North Korea, the axis of chaos. So we will soon have a new administration. And before we dive into the issue of regulations, which is cyber regulation, which is the topic of this conference, I really want to ask you about the pressing cyber challenges that this next administration should prioritize, in your opinion, in its first 100 days. And in what ways you think it might build on or reorient the objectives that you guys laid out in 2023 strategy, especially in the face of an evolving cyber threat landscape?
Absolutely.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
Hear me now? Yes. So first, it's wonderful to be back here at Columbia. It's wonderful to be back here in New York City. I consider New York my home city, even though I've lived away for 20 years. It's great to feel the energy, the diversity. There's no place like New York. So thank you very much for having me here. I'll also note that this conference is at a particularly unique moment in time, where, as you noted, we face rapidly changing, innovating cyber adversaries, and the administration has really adopted using both a regulatory and a voluntary approach and been assessing how do we achieve the most rapid outcomes, because let's be honest, defense is a lot harder than offense. So I'll talk a bit about those adversaries. I want to note some of the key partners we've had in the administration, the acting National Cyber Director, Kemba Walden, who worked on the strategy. Really terrific work. I see the team from the FSISAC, private sector leaders here. So really wonderful and thank you always for the partnership. So as we think about key challenges, I'm going to bin them into 3 bins. China, criminal groups like ransomware actors, and then AI, which cuts across all. So when we look at countries, and I'll use China as the example, well-resourced, sophisticated offensive cyber program that's focused not just on espionage collection. That's been a problem for 15 years. China's been stealing corporate secrets, corporate R&D to advance their economy, stealing government secrets. Let's be candid, all governments do, most governments do. What's really changed with China, we've seen, is pre-positioning in pipelines, in water systems, in power systems, which don't have intelligence value. And our concern is that that pre-positioning is to disrupt, to make it difficult to operate those systems in a time of crisis or conflict. And when we think about the US and China, there's a difference in our national defense models. China has a national firewall. They have complete surveillance of national networks. The US obviously is a democracy. Government doesn't monitor networks in the United States. So as a result, when we think of the continuum from defense to offense, we're more constrained in use of our offensive cyber tools. And our assessment of blowback is always going to be more careful about the risks because we don't have a national firewall protecting us. So that's China. With that said, the most disruptive set of adversaries today in cyberspace are criminal groups, notably ransomware groups based out of Russia. I just was the US representative at a UN Security Council session on Friday, where we brought this topic to the table. And you had the Director General of the World Health Organization talk about a global health risk because of this. We had the CEO of a national hospital chain talk about how they couldn't operate for weeks. They were using runners to run images into surgery as a result. That's driven by cryptocurrency and the $1.3 billion in ransoms paid in the US alone in 2023. And it's driven by a global ecosystem and the fact that Russia provides safe haven. But it's a global problem. 51% of ransomware attacks occur against the US, 49% are on a port in Japan, a hospital chain in Croatia, etc. And then the final threat is AI. And I view it as a threat and an opportunity. We'll talk more about it. It accelerates offense and defense, but I think it offers a unique opportunity to get at the hardest parts of defense, so to be more of a disruptor on defense in a positive way. So in sum, that's where we see the most evolving threats. Mm-hmm. And as we think about what the administration has done in each of those areas, we've learned a lot about what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what we would best as we pass the baton, much as we received the baton, because we're lucky these are really bipartisan issues. As we pass it on, what we share about what we learned on both sides.
And what do you think in the first 100 days the administration could or should be focusing on in particular in those areas?
It fits to the topic at hand.
Yeah.
What we've learned, and I'll share the statistics in a moment, is that we must have minimum regulations across critical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Because if our pipelines and our ports leave their digital doors and windows open, then it's too easy. Right. We need to make it riskier, costlier, and harder for the Chinese. So the first piece is put in place a comprehensive minimum cybersecurity requirements framework for critical infrastructure companies. Right. It doesn't need to be the local grocery store, but it should be across throughout. Put in place grants for things like New York State has done, where there are shared services, where New York City offers a security operations center across the state, so the smaller parts of the state have a way to detect threats that occur. Right. And then build on our international partnerships that the administration has built, whether the Counter-Ransomware Initiative, the Quad, the Japan and Korea partnership, to deepen intelligence sharing, and frankly, to deepen interactions with countries like China, to pressure Russia not to allow a safe haven, so countries are aligned in that approach.
So let's move on to talking about a piece of this, which is about regulation. So you joined administration 2021, right, January?
Day one.
Day one. Your team put in place greater regulation, as you mentioned, and the idea that voluntary commitments from the private sector were not producing results when it came to really stopping cyber attacks. And so we talked, I'm sure this will come up if it didn't already. United States suffered the SolarWinds incident a few months later, the Colonial Pipeline ransom attack. So this was a huge shift. And can you tell us a little bit more? You already started the challenge that were to put in place this regulation. Like, what did it take to do it? And if you look back where we are right now, how effective were these regulations?
So let's start with the final question, because every question has to start with impact.
Yep.
And I pulled the statistics. I actually have them here because I just pulled them last night to get them as current as I could. So the first 3 sectors that we rolled out, the first ever minimum cybersecurity regulations, were pipelines, obviously following the disruptive ransomware attack against Colonial Pipeline, railroads, whether it's commercial or human railroads, whether it's Amtrak or the railroads that transport hazardous materials, and aviation, airports and airlines. And the first thing we had to do was define what those cybersecurity standards were. And lesson learned, 1, was that there's some tailoring sector by sector. But as they were rolled out, so a year ago, October of 2023, once we had defined the standards and did an assessment, an inspection of each critical company against them, 53% of pipelines met minimum cybersecurity standards. The rest failed. Today, October 2024, last month, 100% of the critical pipelines, there's about 90 in the United States, meet minimum cybersecurity requirements under TSA's regulations. Let's talk about rail. When that regulation went into effect and then the first round inspections occurred, 21% of the railroads, for folks who've come from Washington or come from elsewhere, met requirements. Today, 68% do. They were rolled out 6 months after pipeline, so it's a matter of time. And the aviation, which was most recently rolled out last spring, 0% met the minimum cybersecurity requirements in October, and then 57% meet them today. So that gives you a picture of both, you measure what matters, right? Defining what the requirement is, and then frankly measuring it. And under regulatory authorities, TSA, which is the regulator, can't just measure it. They also can give a plan and say, okay, folks, you've got to address what it takes, and we're coming back to inspect thereafter. Yeah. So that's really the impact piece. Mm-hmm. And in terms of what we learned, your first question, because this is a university and the goal is learning and sharing. So
and learning how to get this done.
Exactly. And I want to give a moment shout out to the TSA administrator, who has been a remarkable partner. He's a retired military official, military officer, and I think that came through in the execution. So Colonial Pipeline happened, and the president turned to me and said, Anne, how could this happen? How can you shut down the only pipeline along the eastern seaboard? How could a group of criminals based in Russia? So beyond the geopolitical side of that, and we can talk about President Biden's conversations with President Putin about this in a moment, but the real issue was we weren't requiring any cybersecurity rules for the pipeline. Yeah. If we weren't requiring it, we had health and safety rules for other things, then companies that wanted to make the investments did. The majority do what is required, right? There's always more costs. The goal is revenue. So based upon that, for the first time ever, the president used his emergency authorities for pipelines. And we quickly rolled out requirements and only then started consulting with the private sector. Lesson number 1. That wasn't a good idea. So took a step back, invited the roughly 90 pipeline CEOs to the White House, 3 rounds of meetings in the Situation Room, cleared them to get intelligence for the day, briefed them on the threat. So they were brought into the problem, right? They felt like they were a partner. And then we said, okay, which of these regulations, look, we've got to be realistic. we have to raise them to a level where it is making it harder for adversaries. We don't want just security window dressing. We also recognize you've got costs, and we have to be realistic. And as a result, we negotiated, updated those first regulations, and as you would expect, when it came time to roll out the second round of railroads, guess who was brought in first?
Private sector.
Right? So lesson learned in that way.
You have a postmortem in the making here, so you're taking notes. Terrific. So
engage the implementers at the start.
yeah, no, that is a really critical piece, and we will get back to talking about it even in the context of AI and how we should think about that too. So it seems like from this conversation, it sounds like part of the challenge, at least, was that we were working in the United States, but there was a lack of universal or clear standards, which is, frankly, quite shocking, given the seriousness of the threats that we're facing. Now we have a Supreme Court's recent overturning of the Chevron deference, and how will this decision, you think, will impact regulation going forward? The platform, as you've seen, of the incoming Trump administration has vowed to, quote, raise the security standards for critical systems and networks. But now we have this tension given that with the Chevron ruling. Do you think the regulations that your team put in place are going to stick?
So this is a really smart group. And I will say, I suspect, does everybody here know the Chevron ruling?
Yeah, maybe just for background. We have a lot of people tuning in on the live stream, so.
Great. So I'm not a lawyer. Essentially, the Chevron ruling said that courts deferred to agencies if, in terms of interpreting broad statutes and how they're implemented in a given case, right? They're saying that a given agency, whether it's EPA as a regulator for water and environmental solution, whether the Department of Energy as a regulator for energy systems, a sense that as the expert agencies, in terms of interpreting broad statutes, the courts would defer to them. Chevron rolled that back and said instead implementation had to be more matched to the textual understanding and a reasonable understanding of what those laws represented. I am not a lawyer. If there's a lawyer in the room who wants to, Ari, anything you'd correct on that? Okay. So in the area of cyber regulation, where laws were defined a long time ago, right? For example, let's talk about railroad safety, right? There are rules regarding the safety of railroad systems when they were analog systems, right? Or to prevent security around tracks, etc. Today, signaling systems are digital systems, and we've seen those systems being hacked, for example, in Eastern Europe. So certainly Chevron represents a challenge to cybersecurity regulations. Our focus, we believe, believe that the regulations we've done are very true to both the letter of the law and the spirit, in that as new technologies were adopted in those sectors, the safety regulations evolve, is our understanding, along with those new technologies. But it's certainly something that we're focused on watching, because the Chevron ruling does introduce some potential challenges to the expanding cyber regulations.
Yeah, no, this is definitely something that we will have to follow closely and see what happens. But let's talk a little bit about the role of the state. And here, we will hear from the governor soon, and how New York State is playing a big role in regulation, and has been quite active in this domain. So if we're thinking about how, other states getting involved, and how, if so, how does the federal government keep all of this harmonized in a way? So if you can speak a little bit about the role of states and harmonization.
Absolutely. And New York State has really been a leader. So it's appropriate that, you have New York State as a partner here, not only because we're obviously here in New York City, but because New York State has led for the nation in their regulations. Certainly Governor Hochul's leadership, I don't know if Colin Ahern is here, who's her lead on cyber issues, and really a strategic leader and an implementer, and I know a guide for many states. So New York State has done both both the regulatory aspect, for example, setting regulations for energy systems, some work done with regard to ransoms, but also really excellent operational ideas, like the first step in detecting threats on a network is having network monitoring and a security operations center where people look and say, is that a false positive or is that a real threat? Well, as you could imagine, you know from your background, security operations centers are 24/7 centers staffed to a certain level, and some of the time is just, there isn't necessarily work. So adding more capacity. So what New York City has done is said, we'll offer a shared service for smaller counties across the state, so that skilled people can offer that resource in smaller counties that may not have the ability to hire people, or the resources can benefit from that. And frankly, when the governor says, give me a picture of risk across New York State networks, she now has a way to get the answer. So New York State has really led in both of those. To your question on federal versus state regulation, which is an issue on areas like AI, issues on data privacy, it's been less of an issue in cyber just because federal regulations pretty much have only been rolled out in the last 3 years. And very few states, New York, Colorado has done some work, have really been rolling out state-level regulations. So we need more of this in this space.
Terrific. And as I said, we will hear more about what New York State, has done in the next panel. So we talked a bit. We said that we're going to come back to this because you can't have a conference on this topic without also mentioning AI and other emerging technologies and how they impact national security. So here at SIPA, at IGP, we're doing really some groundbreaking research around the role of AI and democracy, and looking at how this intersects with the topic of disinformation, not just in terms of elections here, but globally, how we're seeing the patterns overall. But we also hear reports about AI's ability to write malicious code that can act as force multiplier for cyber attacks, and so that's the interconnection between AI and cyber security. With AI becoming even more deeply embedded in security and defense, how do you think this can change the scope or intensity of offensive and defensive cyber operations? And do you think AI makes cyber defenses more resilient or actually more vulnerable, or both, depending on conditions? Where do you stand on those issues? What do you think?
They're really the perfect question. So I've had the privilege of both running offensive and defensive cyber operations. And I think as we look at it, defense is so much harder, right? A defender has to be securing every door and window. There's lots in here, and unknown openings. An offensive actor only has to find one way in. So we're certainly concerned about the way AI can assist on offense, right? What keeps me up at night are finding a broadly used a vulnerability in broadly used tech that's not easily patchable, right? So those are the kinds of ways. So certainly on offense, we see ability there. We're seeing countries build programs, swarms of drones, for example, controlled, whether it's radio frequency, whether it's cyber, is certainly a concern there. On defense, how many folks here have done cyber defense in practice? So you'll all say, right, it's a lot of manual work. It's really hard to tell what's normal on a network to figure out what's anomalous. It's really hard to look through firewall logs and find something, particularly when we look at techniques like China's using, where they'll get passwords and then log in at odd times, or add a configuration setting that may be the first time ever that's been done, but it's legitimate, right? So as a result, I truly believe that AI can be a massive force multiplier on defense, both in finding vulnerabilities in code and accelerating patches. We launched a DARPA AI Cyber Challenge. 2-year program. It finished its first year, and it indeed showed that for a set of pre-placed vulnerabilities, the teams found all of them using LLMs in open source code, but also built the patch, and that's the key. And then similarly, we have a number of pilots going on right now to work to find the level of what is normal in a given network. For example, hunting on the Department of Defense's network, massive network, where they see hundreds of millions of events regularly. Right. So that's my sense and my hope and my prayer that on defense, if we can use AI in operational technology, we'll have a bigger delta in impact.
That's really, really interesting. So let's move now to another topic you mentioned, cryptocurrencies and blockchain. We know these technologies introduce both, as with any technologies, right? Opportunities, there are risks, here, especially in the cyberspace. So how do you think government should balance innovation with regulation, balance the innovation and the regulation part in this sector? And especially if we're thinking about it in terms of how can we prevent ransomware and other financial cyber crimes. And so how can we do this kind of assessment and balancing of the risks and the opportunities?
We really need responsible innovation. As you said, we see cryptocurrency fueling three kinds of risks today.
Right.
Certainly fueling ransomware attacks, because this is the way that ransomware attackers make money and move money around the world. We see it in terms of funding all kinds of illicit activities, from sanctions evasion to trafficking in persons to terror activity. And finally, we see countries like North Korea hacking the stores where crypto is stored and essentially gleaning billions of dollars that we believe funds the majority of their missile program. Advancements that bring huge instability to that region and potentially intercontinentally as well, right? So major risks there. President Biden issued a digital assets executive order that focused on responsible innovation to say we need to bring the anti-money laundering rules from fiat currency into crypto. We need to ensure that we're rapidly looking at the blockchain's public, to find illicit transactions in line. And the public and private sector are working better together. So a shout out to the recent stand-up of an ISAC, an information sharing analysis group for cryptocurrency. We stood up as part of the counter ransomware initiative, a 70-country partnership the White House built, a focus on implementing anti-money laundering rules. We gave a week-long training. The FBI, the Treasury send agents to different countries to help, especially countries which are really central points of cryptocurrency money laundering, like the Seychelles, the Cayman Islands. So I think there's real room for government and private sector to work together in those three areas. Bringing AML to crypto, finding illicit transactions faster, whether government or the private sector, and then building the international networks, sharing bad wallets, et cetera, to really cut down illicit use.
That's great. Very last question, very quickly. We are a policy school, you studied here. What do you think the role that we can play in shaping the conversation and impact in this area?
I really felt privileged in my years at SIPA. And one of the wonderful things, and I think you've done a lot of that here, is certainly giving students the history on given areas, bringing in practitioners to have honest conversations about challenges and lessons learned, and then testing ideas. So a great example today, right? Governor Hochul's here talking about New York State has led on cyber regulations. I've talked about our lessons learned at the federal level. What has she learned at the state level? Convening then individuals who lead cyber efforts around the country. They're going to be different because a water system in rural Texas is very different from the water system that manages Niagara, right? So there are some technologies that are lessons learned, regulations. So really, I would say, enabling students to learn, there's almost so much work to be done, and there's nothing like the talented student base here. Bringing together practitioners at international, federal, and state levels, and promoting new ideas. Because as you know, practitioners often don't have time and are eager to hear new ideas for them to try to implement.
Terrific. Cannot thank you enough for being with us and for everything that you are doing. Thank you all for joining, and we are going.
Thank you.